Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Roseman, and today we're going to take a look at post-classical Japan from approximately 600 CE all the way up to around 1600 CE. So we're going to go a little bit into the early modern era, even though feudal Japan will last until the late 1860s. We're going to look at two processes that developed in post-classical Japan today, Sinification and Feudalism. So, a couple things before we get started on Sinification and feudalism in Japan. Should know that, remember that Japan is in East Asia just as China and Korea are, Japan being a neighbor to both of those states. Originally, the people of Japan had migrated, and we're talking about back to the Foundations era and well before that, from China via the Korea Peninsula into Japan. And as people started populating Japan, lots of clans started to form on the main island of Japan called Honshu. For those people who settled in Japan, most found it very difficult to find high quality soil for agriculture. So that's mainly because so much of the land is mountainous. However, there is rich volcanic soil. Mount Fuji, for example, is in Japan, so that adds to the high quality soil for the little that is in Japan. Nonetheless, over thousands of years of settlement in Japan, some major religious beliefs began to form, some of which included animism that over time developed into the Japanese religion of Shintoism. So, animism, we know, is nature spirit worship. For the Japanese, that's called kami. So, for Shintoism, this is a worship of the kami themselves, or the way of the kami. So, even believing that there's spirits in grains of rice. But for the Japanese, rather early on, emperors of Japan became associated with the Shinto faith. We'll see that Japanese emperors very rarely had any sort of true political power. Instead, they were symbols of Japan, but just as importantly, they were the head Shinto priests. The ideas of this came from the belief that the very first Japanese emperor was a descendant of the sun god, whose name was Amaterasu, actually the sun goddess Amaterasu. And so, therefore, all Japanese emperors are, in and of themselves, divine. So, this will be something that is different from the Chinese emperors who, even though they claimed the mandate of heaven, they were not viewed as divine themselves. So, let's take a look here at post-classical Japan now that we've gotten some basics down about the Shinto faith and the religious beliefs about the emperor. You should know that from the start, Japan is highly decentralized. It's very much like Western Europe in the post-classical era. Lots of small states, very difficult time in forming any sorts of political unity. As a result, Japan, for several hundred years, looked to their next door neighbor of China as a source of imitation, particularly the emperors of Japan. So we know the term Sinification means the adoption of Chinese culture, just the adoption of Chinese culture. And we see that between the 600s and 1100 CE, there's a peak of selective Sinification in Japan. So they are picking and choosing aspects of Chinese culture to adopt and bring to and encourage in Japan. And what encouraged this were two major things: a trade relationship with China, as well as the presence of the very strong Tang dynasty. We know also that Japan, for a brief while, from the 600s to the 800s CE, served as a tributary state of the Tang emperor, so giving gifts and kowtowing before the Chinese son of heaven. There was regular exchange of diplomats, ambassadors, so this opened up the door for adopting some features of Chinese culture. There's three major periods for Sinification for Japan: the Taika, Nara, and Heian period. So you can see that's from the 600s to 1100s. Although in the 600s, that's whenever it's really the strongest. And you got to think that this is also the same time as when the Tang Dynasty was absolutely strong, with a strong central government under the rule of the emperor, the Son of Heaven. So a particular Japanese emperor in the year 646 CE announced the Taika reforms. This was direct imperial support for strengthening the emperor's position in Japan, which again, before this point, the emperors really had no true political power. They were just seen as priests. They were essentially symbols for the country, and that's it. So we have an emperor here of Japan in 646 that wants to be strong just like the Son of Heaven in Tang China, who wants to even adopt the title of Son of Heaven. And one way he could do that, actually several ways he could do that, would be to adopt a similar bureaucracy or civil service system like we saw in the Confucian structure of China, going back to the Han Dynasty. That would also include implementing a civil service exam for choosing merit-worthy bureaucrats. Also adopting a single unified army based upon peasant conscription or drafting. By adopting Confucian philosophy as a guiding force in Japan alongside Shintoism, Confucianism would allow for there to be a sense of respect and honor for those people in authority, especially for the emperor, very much like Confucianism encouraged in China as well. There's also regular exchanges in this Taika period of ambassadors and also priests going back and forth between China and Japan. And we know in the early Tang Dynasty, Buddhism was strongly supported by the Tang government. And so Buddhism was introduced into Japan by this time and becomes widespread accepted alongside Shintoism and other local traditions of animism and polytheism. So this is one thing that's going to definitely last, actually two things: the Buddhism and strong Confucian beliefs. They even adopt features of Chinese script. They adopt it to their own Japanese style of speaking, and what becomes kanji script. And we'll definitely see influence from Chinese art and architecture, that rubbing off on Japan. I'll show you some pictures of that here in just a moment. So here's an example of how we can see Chinese architectural styles in this Buddhist temple, Byodo-in Buddhist temple. Notice the curved up roofs. That becomes traditional in China by the early post-classical era. And so we'll see Buddhist temples in Japan following that same imitation of style. Also notice the focus on gardens, the reflecting pool, also of which was common in China at this time. Here's a particularly impressive Buddhist temple called Todaiji Buddhist Temple in Nara, Japan. My understanding is that this is the largest wooden structure, completely wooden structure. And inside there's a large statue, golden statue of the Buddha. So again, you can see the curved roofs from the Chinese style. Okay, so you have the emperor who wanted to adopt a really strong centralized government to imitate Tang China. However, unlike Tang China that was able to limit the power of landed aristocrats and also limit the power of Buddhist monasteries in the long run, we know that those were becoming very widespread in Tang China, especially under Empress Wu. All right. In Japan, the Japanese emperors are not able to actually carry through with their centralizing government reforms. And it winds up being that the Taika reforms are canceled. Two major groups stood in the way of Japan's government being centralized under a powerful emperor. And those two groups were aristocratic families, like the Fujiwara family in particular, and also Buddhist monastics. So we usually have this view of Buddhist monks being absolutely peaceful, which is encouraged by Buddhism, nonviolence, and all of that. However, the Buddhist monastics in Japan were quite rowdy. They actually had riots in streets, fearing that the emperor was going to gain so much power that they would be limited in their local operations. Same thing with aristocratic families, in particular the Fujiwara family, who stood up to the Japanese emperors and basically held them captive in the imperial city, which is going to jump around from place to place depending upon where the aristocratic family that is dominating the imperial family is from. So, with that, the Taika reforms do not last. They don't even really get off the ground when it comes to the centralizing of government. So the Taika reforms wind up being abandoned. Nonetheless, Buddhism and Confucian values are going to be maintained in Japan, and that will make sense more as we go on as to why Confucianism is going to be maintained. All right, we'll come back to that in just a little bit. Aristocrats, aristocratic families, landed aristocrats, they're going to become strong, especially out in the countryside. All right, so unlike China, where the emperor had a strong bureaucracy and could carry out orders, have orders carried out throughout the entire state of Tang China or Song China, here in Japan, there is no bureaucracy. So, in order to create a sense of stability in the local areas, aristocratic families were on the rise. The emperor's power became highly restricted. They never really gained any true power. And one way we see that is that, and this is really cool, that ever since 660 BCE, Japan has had the exact same dynasty ruling. So you might not be aware, but Japan still has an emperor. But they can trace their ancestry back to the same origin, back to 660 BCE. So there's one dynasty, it's called the Yamato dynasty. So you can see why, unlike China, where there's a constant rise and fall of dynasties for so long, where the new family replaced them, there really was no need to replace the emperor because the emperor's family never really had any power. So I thought that was pretty interesting. But anyhow, for the countryside, though, remember again, one of the goals for the Taika reforms and Sinifying the Japanese government was to create a strong central army like China had. But that never happens. Instead, local aristocratic families out in the countryside, there's going to be hundreds of them. They each start to form their own militias or local armies made up of warriors called the samurai. All right, so that's where we get these warriors from. They take the place and fulfill the role, essentially the same as knights in Western Europe in the post-classical era. So with that said, and also samurai means one who serves. So we'll come back to the samurai in just a few moments. So let's take a look first here at life for the imperial family. So again, Taika reforms, they've been canceled. There's no strong central power in Japan. And because of that, they are going to lead a rather superficial life in the imperial capital, basically held hostage by a series of aristocratic families, first being the Fujiwara family. So they have no real political power. The emperors are just those head Shinto priests. They're worshipped as gods, as the sun god. Whereas out in the countryside, all hell's breaking loose. It's chaos because those different aristocratic families with their own samurai forces, they're battling one another for control. All right, very much like we see in post-classical Western Europe, highly decentralized. And what we see arising in its place is in place of a centralized government is feudalism. So while the countryside is being overrun by warlords and these samurai forces, there is solace in the imperial capital. And really, the imperial family doesn't have a lot to do. They keep themselves busy, focused on a life full of etiquette, so following social rules and social graces, They are filling their time with poetry and flower arranging, which apparently is still a, a big hobby in Japan in and of itself. Painting, interior design, writing novels, and actually, surprising enough, we've seen very few societies where women have been literate. Japan is one of those, especially amongst aristocratic families. But we know quite a bit about imperial life because of female novelists. And there's two examples here. The one that you should probably know best is Lady Murasaki. Amongst the imperial family, she wrote the very first novel, at least what most historians refer to as the very first novel. It tells the story of the happenings and going ons of the imperial family. Genji is a prince of the emperor. Discusses his love affairs that are happening here. So essentially, they're living in a bubble in the capital of Japan, whereas again everything is decentralized and based on the feudal system throughout the rest of Japan, out in that countryside.